It's great to welcome to the program today Tom Rivett-Carnac, who is co-author of the book The Future We Choose: Surviving the Climate Crisis. Tom's also a leader in the fields of international diplomacy, energy policy, and climate change. Three areas, Tom, that are relevant if you're going to be involved in the negotiation of the Paris Climate Accords, which you ended up participating in. How did that even come about?
I did. Well, it was a great privilege to be so closely involved in the Paris Climate Accords. I was actually working in New York, where I am right now, and I was working at an NGO called CDP, where I was helping companies identify the types of strategies that would make them more effective to deal with the climate crisis. And in that position, through a friend, I got to meet Christiana Figueres, who's my co-author on this book, and at the time was the executive secretary of the UN Climate Convention. And we spent a day together in New York walking around. And what was clear was that she was obviously surrounded by many brilliant people inside the UN, but there tends to be the emergence of, not groupthink might be a little unfair, but sort of the same solutions to the same problems that you've been struggling with for a long time. And she knew that she wanted somebody in there who could think about the political challenges in a new way. And so that's why she hired me to come and run the political strategy a few years before Paris.
So one of the common, I guess, refrains that I hear from people who take as seriously as we should be the issue of climate change about the Paris Accord is that the final result feels sort of underwhelming. In other words, all of this negotiation just to say, well, we'll commit to limit the increase of temperature above pre-industrial levels. Can you talk a little bit about what the negotiation is actually like and why just looking at the outcome ignores a lot of what goes into even doing this in the first place?
Sure. No, I can definitely talk about that. But one contextualizing comment, because you're absolutely right in what you said, is negotiations and outcomes are pathways, and they're only meaningful if they're followed.
Yes.
Right. That's where it gets interesting. So for many years, the negotiations had been mired in this issue of fairness. Right. So developing countries said to developed countries, you caused this problem. And what's more, you said you'd sort it out in 1991 when the UN first started thinking about this. So go away and do something meaningful about it and then come back and we'll talk about a global agreement. Whereas the developed countries would say, well, the world is different now. Many of the emissions actually come from developing countries. India, China, many other places are developing very rapidly. This now needs to be an everyone, everywhere type of an endeavor. And the challenge is that both of those perspectives were correct, right? And both of them were justified and very defensible. So for a long time, the discussion in the climate negotiations was about, well, whose responsibility is this? And it became mired in this sort of zero-sum mentality of this was a burden that nobody wanted to take on. And everybody was trying to pass around between each other. One of the things I think we did in Paris, or at least we took serious steps towards doing, although it's unfinished business, is we flipped that. You know, dealing with the climate crisis is, of course, an urgent challenge. It is also the biggest economic opportunity. It's the biggest opportunity to improve the quality of our lives. It's the biggest opportunity to improve our biodiversity, our quality of air, et cetera, et cetera. And we started to think about it more around less as a burden to be shared and more of an opportunity to be captured. So that changed the nature of the negotiations to a degree where every country would agree collectively we need to solve this in the long term. And for the next few years, I'll put down my plan as to what I'll do for the next few years that's consistent with my politics, that is of benefit to me as a country. And that enabled the spirit to begin to change, which was the real breakthrough we needed.
So there's a whole range of estimates that are made about what might the planet look like in 5, 10, 30, et cetera years. There's not wholesale agreement, although there are straight out bad faith actors. And then there are just sort of like reasonable disagreements within the communities that are appropriately dealing with this in good faith. In the book, you outline, a possible scenario where we just fail to deal with this issue and what 2050 might look like in that scenario. And then you also talk about moving in the direction by 2050 of carbon neutrality, regenerative economies, and moving in the right direction, so to speak. Is part of the problem on this that even for people who believe the science, it's sort of difficult to really believe that nightmare scenario because it seems so horrifying, and that may cause some sort of paralysis in actually getting going on it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think that there has been this massive discrepancy between the world we see around us, which until recently has largely carried on as we've more or less known it, and these sort of very challenging, very alarming predictions of periods of time that are just a few decades in the future. And I think for many people, it can be difficult to bring those two things together, particularly when the solutions that are proposed seem small, right? They seem like small iterations on your life. Sadly, it's becoming more and more possible to imagine what that negative future might look like, right? I mean, just in the last few months, if we look at the terrible devastation of the wildfires in Australia and the unbelievable loss of life and property and the heartbreaking loss of biodiversity, we look at the disappearance of coral reefs around the world. We look at the warming of the oceans and the hotspots. We look at the burning of the Amazon and of Siberia and of California, the floods in England, the melting of Antarctica. Unfortunately, we are getting sharper relief of what it could be like. And these early signs should wake us up because science tells us we still have time, right? This decade, I would argue, will end up being the most consequential decade in the history of humanity. Now, that's a lot for us to take on board, but we have to face that, and we have to face it now if we're going to have the kind of impact that we need to have to improve the world in the way that we still can.
So on the personal versus structural, we've talked before about how, putting a disproportionate focus on plastic straws distorts the reality that a vast majority of what we have to deal with is actually the output and waste from large corporations, particularly in certain industries that are the disproportionate contributors. So if you talk about plastic straws and making sure that you're sorting your cardboard boxes the right way, that it unfairly puts the burden on individuals when in reality that's not where the burden is. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it seems, from the book, it seems as though you say that there needs to be structural action, but individual action is also important.
Sure. So in the book, we set out what needs to happen in order to get us on this trajectory to create a future that we still can, right? And as you say, that's a variety of actions that we can all participate in. Now, there's three types of actions we talk about. One of those is actually who we are as human beings. Living through this fundamental transformation is not easy for us to embrace that. And we talk about how we can dig into some of the deeper elements of the human psychology to prepare ourselves for that and to be positive actors for a great future. The second thing we talk about is our own activities. So it is true that we are economic actors, we're political actors, we're citizens, we're consumers, we're parents, we're employees, we're teachers, whatever we are. And in all of those roles, there's a huge amount that we can do to create a positive future. And it's very meaningful, right? Every day counts now, whether that's changing your diet, whether it's changing the way you move, changing the way you heat your home, etc., or reimagining your role in the world so that you can actually do something that has a more positive impact or less of a negative impact. And that's really important, right? Individuals have a major role in pushing systems to actually reach tipping points. But we also say, and this is the third category of action that we outline in the book, we need to use the power that we have in relation to national governments, in relation to corporations, in relation to regional governments and state governments, to push them to participate in civil disobedience, to vote in a way that is consistent with the kind of future we want to create. We've left this so late that we can no longer say it's the responsibility of business or investors or governments or individuals. This has to be an everyone, everywhere type of initiative. And I think the problem with that dialogue of where does responsibility lie is it can be cyclical, right? One time it's fashionable to say it's individuals, another time it's fashionable to say it's governments. The truth is it's everyone, and it's urgent, and we need to be on this now.
Yeah, it seems that in a way it can be about recycling and plastic straws and maybe looking at an electric car or something like that. But at the same time, it's about the ability of a population to, at a certain point, say, unless you're seriously going to deal with this, we don't vote you into office.
Right, exactly. Or more than that, we go out on the streets and we shut down operations until, the first duty of a democratic government is to protect its population.
Yes.
By that metric, most governments in the West are failing their most fundamental responsibility. Some are failing reasonably badly, some are failing really badly, and some are doing a reasonably good job.
We've been speaking with Tom Rivett-Carnac, who is co-author of the book The Future We Choose: Surviving the Climate Crisis. Also, the podcast Outrage and Optimism, which you should absolutely check out. Tom, thanks again for your time. I so appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.